Hello, Hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Hunters, if there's one singular, burning, unanswered question about Supernatural's lore that fans still debate to this day, it's this. What the hell are the 5 things that the Colt can't kill? It's truly bizarre that this was never really fully addressed in the show, right? I mean, when first introduced, the Colt is treated as this ultimate weapon, a magical gun forged beneath the light of a comet and imbued with unknowable powers that grant it the ability to kill anything. It's the stuff of legend, even amongst hunters, and in its first few outings, it appeared to live up to the hype, as it was capable of destroying demons, something that, at the time, seemed impossible. So yeah, it's a big deal, and for a while, it seemed like this preternatural pea shooter could be the answer to any enemy that the Winchesters might face. However, that idea crumbled to pieces in Season 5, when the Archangel Lucifer eats a point-blank headshot from the gun, only to pop back up moments later, pissed and sore, but ultimately fine. Okay, so the Colt isn't omnicidal, big whoop. Except the lore drop didn't end there, as Lucy goes on to say this.
There's only 5 things in all of creation that gun can't kill, and I just happen to be one of them.
So yeah, apparently it's not that some beings are immune to the Colt, there are specifically 5 things beyond its power. Well, since the writers chose to be so specific, then it must mean that we'd eventually get the complete list, right? So then after 10 more seasons and a spin-off, what are the other 4?
I don't know, Margot.
Yeah, unfortunately, we never found out. Lucifer is the one and only character confirmed to be on this list. Well, that's at least something, right? Maybe we can use what we know from him to figure out the other unkillables. And yeah, we can try. After all, that's what this whole video is for. But even doing that is more complicated than you might think. Consider the wording in Lucy's statement. 5 things in all of creation. So does that mean 5 individual beings or 5 species? Like, is Lucifer immune because he's an archangel or because he's Lucifer? Also, when he says in creation, does that include the creator? I mean, I don't think anyone believes that God himself is susceptible to a magical cowboy gun, but is he included in the count, or does the phrasing sort of implicitly exclude any beings on his level? There's been plenty of speculation about this topic. In fact, I've already given my thoughts on it in a separate video about the Colt, which you should totally watch. But today, I want to go deeper and really analyze what sort of entities could be immune to the revolver's ultra-lethal power. More than that, I'm not going to give you guys one list of speculative resistors. No, I want to give you my thoughts on every possible interpretation of Lucy's words, whether he means that there's 5 individuals or 5 species that can tank the gunshot, and whether or not that list includes god-tier beings. In total, that'll give us 4 different versions, so let's stop wasting time and just get right the hell in. Before we can speculate about which creatures might resist the Colt's power, I think we need to first lay out which ones we can eliminate because, well, we saw the gun eliminate them. Across its run on the show, the Colt successfully capped 15 critters, with the victims being 7 black-eyed demons, 1 crossroads demon, the Prince of Hell Azazel, 3 vampires, one of which was the Alpha, 1 hellhound, 1 phoenix, and the pagan god Moloch. At a glance, this might seem like a lackluster spread, considering just how many things there are roaming around the world of Supernatural, but I actually think it does narrow down the list quite a bit. After all, we know that pretty much all of demondom is susceptible to the gun, with only white-eyed demons and knights of hell going untested. Also, while the Colt was only used against 2 breeds of earthly monsters, the fact that it could destroy not only an alpha, but the alpha vampire, who's implied to be one of, if not the oldest of Eve's children, well, it really suggests that anything descended from the mother of monsters is fair game for the firearm. I can't prove it, but it makes sense, right? I mean, the whole appeal of the Colt is that it removes the need for specific materials or weapons, as whatever magic it carries can either neutralize or just blow right through creatures' natural immunities. To me, it stands to reason that if this effect works on beings as old and powerful as an alpha monster and a prince of hell, then anything next to or below them on the respective supernatural evolutionary trees should also be susceptible. Also, it's important to remember just how durable some of the Colt's victims really were, more specifically, Azazel. Consider this. What else besides the Colt can off a prince of hell? The only things confirmed to do the trick are an archangel, an archangel's child, and one-of-a-kind magic weapons handmade by an archangel. So, not exactly the kind of juice within reach of most hunters, and to me it really highlights just how potent the Colt really is. It packs the kind of punch reserved for cosmic beings. As such, I feel 100% certain that for something to survive the cult, it can be no less than a top-tier threat. At one point, Chuck stated that archangels like Lucifer were forged from the stuff of primordial creation, and that's the kind of sauce you gotta have in order to stay standing, or at least get back up, in the wake of a cult shot. This means that we can cross off pretty much all monsters, demons, pagan gods, spicy humans like witches and psychics, and most of the uncategorized creatures in the series. Basically, if it took anything less than a quest or high-powered assist to slay a particular creature, then it's probably not surviving the cult. So now that we've laid out the types of beings that can't withstand the gun's juice, let's shift gears and talk about the ones that absolutely positively can. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a single solitary fan who actually, genuinely believes that the super special cowboy gun has any chance of even hurting God, let alone killing him. Like, yeah, we don't technically get any definitive proof, but come the fuck on. He's goddamn God. Not only is he leagues more powerful than Lucifer, for most of the series, he is the most powerfulest being in the multiverse, because he made the multiverse. I also feel pretty confident saying that any being on or around God's general level is also immune. The most obvious example of this would be God's twin sister, Amara, the Darkness. It's an important part of supernatural lore that she and her bro are equals in overall power level, and in fact, at times, it kind of seems like she might be harder to destroy. So yeah, not buying her biting it to the cult. I think most people would agree with this assumption. The real debate is whether or not the twins belong on the list or not. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually get into some possible contenders for cult immunity. And we'll start by examining our only known survivor, Lucifer. What makes Lucy so special? Well, the most obvious thing would be his species. Lucifer is an archangel, a class of being that's not only amongst the most powerful in the show, but also the oldest. To give you an idea of where the arcs sit in the grand scheme of creation, the original four were whipped up before the birth of the universe, handmade by God himself in order to help him fight back against the darkness. So these guys predate the physical universe, and they're equipped with enough power to at least collectively stand up against a being with power equal to God himself. Yeah, I'd say it makes sense that creatures like that would be cult-proof. This actually allows us to fill in one of the readings of the list almost entirely. If we interpret the 5 things in creation to mean 5 individual entities who are created by God, then we could pretty much comfortably add the other 3 archangels, Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel, to the list, leaving us 4 spots filled and only 1 left open. So then, who takes that last immunity idol? Well, I suppose this is as good a time as any to address one of the most frustrating gray areas in the show's lore, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, more specifically, Death incarnate. Capital D Death is demonstrably one of the most powerful characters in Supernatural. Whether it's the original Big D or one of his successors, the Grand Reaper wields an incredible amount of influence over the universe, effortlessly able to bend time, space, and destiny to their will. I mean, they were meant to be the embodiment of death, so it makes sense that they'd be pretty strong. And in my opinion, it doesn't make sense that a being like that could be capped by a man-made 6-shooter. Most fans seem to think the same, yet there is room to debate. After all, we saw not 1, not 2, but 3 versions of Death die. The first 2 were axed by their own scythes, which I personally don't find too damning. However, then there's the third Death, Betty, who met her end at the hands of Lucifer, who was somehow able to dust her with just a snap of his fingers. Now, I don't want to get too anime power scaly here, but the fact that such a powerful being was taken out by a supposedly weaker creature does kind of call into question just how potent they really are. Personally, I still think that Death is stronger than the devil, and that the only reason Lucifer was able to gank Betty was because she was brand new to the role, and Lucy had been given a power boost from God so that he could nab the Death book. However, even if Death and or his bros are cult-proof, that's not the only issue here. See, it's never really clarified where Death, or any of the horsemen for that matter, came from. For the longest time, it seems like Death, at least, sat on the same level as God, with the original Death outright stating that he was as old or older than the big man. However, it was later revealed that there are apparently multiple Deaths across the multiverse, which kind of reframed things to make it seem like Death may simply be another creation who was fed a story. The distinction is important here because it really determines which version of the list Death and his other horsemen qualify for. And yet, we don't have a definitive answer about which side of the primordial divide they sit on. I've actually made an entire video laying out my thoughts on what the horsemen are, with the short answer being that they're embodiments of concepts that predate the multiverse, but which became integral parts of creation once God locked up his sister. I stand by what I said in that video, so for the purposes of this one, I'm going to consider horsemen to be primordial beings which are not considered part of creation in the same way as archangels. So that would mean that none of the horsemen would qualify for the 5 individuals, no primordials version of the list, meaning we still have one member to uncover. It's kind of tough to narrow down. There aren't any more archangels, and while there are a few species that might be cult-proof, it's hard to zero in on one particular member in order to fit this version of the list. One standout option would be Eve, the mother of monsters. Eve is a pretty unique creature. She's some sort of ancient thing of unclear origin, and while she does have a connection to another species that I'll get into later, none of her supposed kin are quite the same as Eve herself. All we really know about Eve's origins is that she was born in purgatory, and she's been around for a very long time. In fact, she's so old that she allegedly predates angels like Castiel, and that dude's been around for a long time. It's not clear if this means that she's also older than archangels, but whatever the case, she's really ancient and incredibly powerful, to the point that she can negate magic of angels like Castiel. Her only known weakness is the ashes of a phoenix. And fun fact, the only reason that weakness exists in the first place is because Eve herself accidentally created the phoenixes as one of her twisted monster experiments. Yeah, if you haven't seen the show, then let me assure you, her title of Mother of Monsters isn't figurative. Eve is personally responsible for creating many of the creatures that hunters hunt, things like vampires, werewolves, ghouls, djinn, shapeshifters, and more. So really old, really powerful, and really hard to gank. Sounds like a perfect contender for immunity, right? Well, yeah, actually. I genuinely don't think that the cult could kill Eve. She fits the bill quite nicely. So that's one list down, right? The 5 individuals, non-primordial beings that the cult can't kill are Michael, Lucifer, Raphael, Gabriel, and Eve? Well, maybe, but I don't think so. I know I just said that the gun probably can't kill Eve, but when it comes to this specific reading of the information, I actually think there's a character who fits the bill a little better. So let's put a pin in Eve for now and pivot back to Lucifer for a sec. I mentioned how God made the Archangels to fight his sister, right? Well, once the battle was won, Amara wasn't killed. Instead, she was sealed away, locked up in some inescapable prison tucked away somewhere in reality, with the lock to this prison manifesting as a physical mark which had to be held by someone at all times lest the darkness be released. Lucifer carried the mark for God knows how long. However, once he got fed up with the dark influence, he decided to pass the burden on to an early human named Cain, and from then on, the mark was known as the Mark of Cain. The thing about the mark is that it comes with a number of side effects, one of which is that the bearer becomes almost impossible to permanently kill. I don't mean kinda hard to kill. I mean the subject of death himself personally offing someone with the mark was brought up, and his response left it unclear if he could do it. That is nuts. But it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, this is literal god-tier magic, so it's bound to be pretty potent. Now, we do see that if a human with the mark takes enough damage, then they'll quote-unquote die for a little while, but eventually they'll rise again, now transformed into a demon that is all but unkillable outside of some very specific circumstances. With that in mind, I submit to you that not only is the mark bearer the final member of this version of the list, they also have a presence on every version of it. Again, this is a capital G god-level magic. I just don't think that it makes sense for the cult to be able to bypass the protection it offers. Though I guess technically it would be able to kill a human with the mark, they just come back later. And yeah, that's my official submission for the first version of the immunity list. The 4 archangels and the bearer of the mark of Cain, which would have just been Cain himself when Lucifer brings it up in season 5. Though under this criteria, the list would technically expand to 6 for about a year and a half when both Cain and Dean Winchester carried copies of the mark. So 1 version down and 3 more to go. We'll probably have to sift through a whole bunch more lore and information in order to assemble the remaining listicles, right? Well, actually, we've already done a lot of the heavy lifting needed to assemble not 1, but 2 more possible variations of the Colt Can't Kill Club. After all, in addition to the Archangels and the Mark Bearer, we, or at least I, believe that God and his sister are pretty much guaranteed to be immune to the cult, and that it's pretty widely accepted that Death, if not all 4 horsemen, are also likely to be cult-proof. These folks weren't included in the previous version of the list since it interprets Lucy's statement as referring to 5 things created by God. But if we instead read the wording of in creation as less of a literal qualifier and expand our criteria to include these so-called primordial beings, then we end up with up to 6 more cult tankers, for a grand total of 11 intrinsically immune individual entities. Obviously, that creates a few problems for the 5 individuals including Primordials version of the club, but for now, let's keep things a little simpler by packaging these beings together into their respective races or species, and sort out the version of the list in which 5 things refers to categories of entities rather than individual beings. Right off the bat, we can compress the first version of the list from 5 entries down to 2, Archangels and Mark Bearers. Solid start, but unfortunately, when it comes to grouping the others, well, we've reached another bit of lore messiness. See, there's a term that I've been using in this video and many others, primordials, or primordial beings, and I've used it in reference to both the God Twins and the Horsemen. So, does that mean that they're all the same type of creature, and thus collectively fill out a single bullet point on the list? Well, here's the thing. Despite how often I use this term, it's not exactly a solid part of supernatural canon, instead sitting in a kind of hazy gray area of the official lore. Like, I'm pretty sure that it is used at least once within the show, but we're never really given a solid definition for the term or criteria for who or what qualifies for membership. When I use the phrase, it's to identify things that are not only old and powerful, but also stuff that didn't necessarily come from God, instead existing on the same kind of greater existential level as he did. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that all primordials are directly related or the same species, just of similar origin. With that in mind, I don't feel like it makes sense to put primordials as a whole on the list. So instead, I'm going to group the God Twins and Horsemen as separate categories, leaving us with just one slot to fill for this version of the list. So who or what could it be? Well, if you've seen the show, then you're probably screaming at the screen right now because there's one more quote-unquote primordial entity that I haven't addressed yet. The Shadow, a mysterious, self-described cosmic entity that rules over a realm known as the Empty. We know next to nothing about this thing's greater lore, but the precious little that we did see convinced many fans, myself included, that this thing does in fact fit into the upper echelons of supernatural power scale. So, then it must be on the list, right? Well, it's definitely immune to the Colt. Like, I'm not going to deny that. But I do have to wonder, did Lucifer even know about the Shadow? Like, this thing rules over a realm that angels like Cass don't even know about. And pretty much anything that ends up getting sent there never comes back. I definitely think that there's an argument to be made that even the Archangels themselves were ignorant to the Empty, and so the realm's ruler wouldn't be included in Lucy's list, despite the fact that it's definitely immune. Now, it's true that Naomi knew about the Shadow, but not only is she the head of Heaven's CIA division, by the time she brought up the Shadow, she'd probed the brains of God's personal scribe and secret keeper, as well as Castiel, the only angel to have ever come back from the dead at that point. Look, I'm going to include the Shadow as its own unique entry on this version of the list, but I just want you to keep the idea of it not being there in the back of your mind. Anyway, that makes our second version of the list the God Twins, the Shadow, Horsemen, Archangels, and the bearer of the Mark of Cain. But what if the list includes primordials, but was only made up of individuals and not entire species? Well, by this point, I actually think this might be the easiest variant to fill out. I mean, God and Amar are givens, and I'll personally die on the hill that Death is immune to the Colt, even if his brothers aren't, so that's 3. Combine those with Lucifer, who's confirmed, and once again, we're left with 1 vacancy. Based on what I said earlier, the last spot has to go to the Shadow, right? Or should it go to Cain? After all, I did say that I thought the Mark Bearer should be on every version of the list, so does that mean it's more unkillable than the Shadow? Well, I definitely don't think that's true, but I do believe that the best version of this interpretation of the list includes the marked one, and not the Shadow. And here's why. It could actually help explain why Lucifer would be immune, but not the other Archangels. I mean, yeah, Lucy is pretty freaking powerful, but canonically, he's not the strongest of the 4. That honor goes to Michael. Also, despite a few lines of dialogue later in the series, Lucifer was originally introduced as being younger than Michael, meaning that he wouldn't even be the oldest Arch. Again, that detail gets a little fuzzy later in the show when they start leaning into the idea that Lucifer was older and maybe even God's first creation, but personally I like to stick with the lore that was introduced earlier by Eric Kripke because it fit with the show's themes better. So if that's the case, then how could I possibly justify Lucifer being immune, but not his stronger, probably older brother? Well, the only explanation that makes sense to me is that, unlike Mike, Lucy carried the Mark of Cain for a time, and even after passing it on, he retained traces of its power. Hell, it's possible that he still had the damn thing on him up until the end of Season 10, and instead of fully transferring the curse to Cain, he instead gave him a copy, just as Cain would later do to Dean. To be clear, the Shadow would still be immune to the gun under this version of the list, but it wouldn't be counted among the 5, either because Lucy didn't know about it, or because he thought it was weaker than it actually is. This is probably the version of the list that I'm the least comfortable with, but I feel like these 5 are the most likely to be who Satan was referring to if we interpret his words in this particular way, which I really don't want to do, but, I had to include it. Alright, we're 3 down with only 1 left to go, and I've saved this one for last because it's the one that I think best fits the show's lore. Ever since seeing Abandon All Hope for the first time, I've always interpreted Lucifer's words to mean that the cult was useless against 5 species or categories of supernatural creatures, and that didn't include God, because, well, obviously mere humans can't build something powerful enough to destroy the Almighty. This belief only got stronger and stronger as the show went on, and we saw more and more heavy-hitter entities who pushed the guys to the limits of resourcefulness, to the point that by Season 10, I was fully convinced that no other interpretation would make sense. So, to end this video, let's talk about the 5 types of entities, not including primordials, that the cult can't kill. First up, Lucy's on the list because he's an archangel, and that's 1. I also still don't believe it makes sense that the fancy magic cowboy gun could overcome the literal god magic woven into the mark, so its bearer stays on the list in the number 2 spot. Earlier, I made a case for Eve's inclusion, and this is where she fits in at number 3. During that spiel, I also mentioned that there was another species connected to Monster Mom, that being the Leviathans. Like Eve, the Levi's are some of the oldest creatures in creation. OG Death referred to them as the Old Ones, and the First Beasts. In fact, he directly stated that they predated both mankind and angeldom. Once again, it's not clear if this includes the Archangels. A later monologue by Big D himself kind of makes it seem like it doesn't, but either way, we know that the species, or at least their essence or whatever, has been around since before the creation of the universe, as nectar from the Leviathan blossoms serves as one of the key ingredients in the primordial sealing spell used to lock up Amara and create the Mark of Cain. That already makes me very, very certain that they'd survive a cult cap, but if you're not convinced yet, then let's go over the other confirmed methods of Leviacide. The only confirmed way to fully kill a Leviathan, on Earth at least, is with the bone of a righteous mortal washed in the blood of a fallen angel, an alpha monster, and the ruler of hell. That's one hell of a quest, one that, for the average hunter, will most likely involve at least one boss fight. It's also worth mentioning that this is a recipe from God himself, and whenever something requires God-tier cheat codes to gank, you know it's pretty friggin' tough. With all that in mind, I think it makes perfect sense to include the Chompers in this version of the Cult Proof Club. Though that does raise the question, are they a separate entity from Eve? I mean, it's made clear in the show that they are related in some way, with the Alpha Vamp going as far as to believe that they were just fully being the same species. I've made a whole video theorizing about what exactly Eve is, but the short answer is that while she's closely related to the Leviathans, she's not a full Chomper herself. Watch that video for specifics, but essentially a combination of dialogue from the show and statements from other official sources led me to conclude that Eve is something closer to a half-Leviathan hybrid. So you could maybe group them together, but I wouldn't, for the same reasons I wouldn't categorize humans and Nephilim as the same race. So my official stance is that Eve and the Levi's are 2 separate things, both of which are most likely immune to the cult. Once again, we're left with a single unfilled slot. I didn't plan that, but here we go. So what sort of super species might take this final opening? Perhaps it's the white-eyed demons, like Lilith and Alistair. After all, Lilith is the oldest and strongest demon ever, surpassing even the princes in Hell's hierarchy. Or what about the Knights of Hell? They're also uber-powerful demons, ones trained by Cain himself, and sturdy enough to warrant execution by the first blade. Or maybe it's regular angels. We never got to see one go up against the gun, so for all we know, Lucifer's immunity wasn't a matter of being an archangel, but rather him being any type of angel. If that's the case, then we'd also have to include Nephilim, since these half-angel hybrids are stated to be stronger than their fully angelic parent, and I mean, Lucy's son Jack is pretty inarguably cult-proof. Or what about ghosts? I mean, the idea of killing a ghost is already kind of weird, but it gets stranger when you specify shooting a ghost to death. Like, would the bullet have to hit their ghost vital organs? Or would grazing any part of their spectral form poof them like iron bullets do? Just, permanently. many possibilities, but I don't think that it's any one of the ones I just listed. Let's start with ghosts. As silly as the idea of killing a ghost is, we do know that it is possible in Supernatural. I mean, demons are essentially just a type of ghost, and they can be killed. Even beyond that, we see that there are ways to destroy a non-demonic ghost, so I'm certain that the Colt can bust pretty much any type of ghost, though like demons, they may need to be inside a mortal meat suit for the hit to count. Next, Nephilim and non-Archangels. Admittedly, the rationale here feels a bit more power scaly than usual, but I still think it holds up. Basically, we saw that Nephilim sired by regular angels can be put down via angel blade, something that can't be said about archangels, or even princes of hell. That makes me doubt that they could withstand the Colt, and since Nephilim are stated to be stronger than the angel that sired them, it stands to reason that those angels would also be susceptible to the gun. Now, I will admit that Lucifer's son Jack is an exception. I don't think that's a shocking or controversial opinion, but I also don't think that Arch Nephilim or whatever count here, because based on how everyone reacted to Jack's conception, it really seems like he was the first of his kind, and so hybrids of his caliber wouldn't have been a thing when Five Things was first established. That just leaves white-eyed demons and knights of hell, and I'll be honest, my reasoning for excluding these species from the list are probably the shakiest. I know it's stated that the knights like Abaddon could only be slain by the first blade, but if that's the case, then why was she so scared of taking on a single random angel? Why didn't we see her tank hits from the angel blade, or really anything other than the demon knife? It's also worth noting that of the 4 demons that survived death blows from the knife, Abaddon seemed to be hurt the most from her jab. Also, the princes of hell are susceptible to the Colt, and princes outrank knights? Can't argue with that. Look, I'm not saying that the knights are weak or easy to take out, just that the ones without the mark probably aren't as indestructible as Cain made them out to be. As for the white-eyed demons, well, I'll be completely honest, I don't really have a strong, fact-based argument here. Lilith was confirmed to be the oldest and strongest demon ever, even more than the princes, literally being the first and most powerful hellspawn to ever live. Not only that, her death, under very specific circumstances mind you, was required to start the apocalypse. So there's a strong argument to be made for her being unkillable under pretty much any other situation. As for Alistair, well, he's kind of a wild card in general. We don't really know much about him, though he was pretty strong, capable of tanking the knife, and held a prestigious rank as Hell's Grand Torturer. Still, he did seem weaker than Lilith based on Sam's psychic attacks in Season 4, so it's really hard to say just how similar these two really are. Honestly, I think it's quite possible that Lilith, at least, was cult-proof. But I'm choosing to leave her and Al off the list, and really the reasoning comes down to vibes. Lilith was old, most likely one of the first humans to walk the earth. But she's still not as ancient or fearsome as the Archangels, Leviathans, or Eve. Really, the larger issue for me is that demons in general just don't feel like they have the gravity to be in the same class as Archangels or other uber ancients, with Cain being an exception due entirely to him holding the mark. Maybe this is my dumbass take, but I stand by it. So then, what exactly is this mysterious fifth and final race or group of creatures strong enough to withstand the Colt? Well, my answer, as it has always been, is the Shadim. If you don't remember the Shadim, I don't blame you. They only came up once, we never got to see them in action, or at all really, since the only glimpse we ever got of them was a single gnarly hand poking out of a hell pit. We don't even really know much about them, just that they're, quote, hell's most savage, and that they were locked away in the pit due to being so dark that God himself wouldn't let them into the light. There is a chance that they're a type of demon, but the way that they're described and visualized really makes me think that they probably aren't, instead being a separate class of creature that roams the halls of hell, kind of like hellhounds. I've made a whole video speculating about what these shady creatures could possibly be, but ultimately, we don't know for sure. So, then why in Chuck's name would I think that these random-ass creatures from a random-ass episode are capable of tanking a Colt shot? Well, essentially, it comes down to 2 tidbits of lore that we got about them. First is the aforementioned being locked up in their own little slice of hell, seemingly by God himself, which harkens back to the Leviathans, who got a similar treatment, kind of making it seem like the Shadim could be as dangerous. You know what else suggests that? Apparently, Lucifer feared the Shadim. So much so, in fact, that he kept them caged and refused to even attempt to weaponize them against his enemies. Keep in mind that Lucy isn't exactly known for being cautious, humble, or pragmatic, This dude literally squared up to 1v1 Amara, a being so powerful that her twin, God, needed to whip up 4 ultra-potent creations, including Lucy himself, in order to tag team a win in direct combat. Like, at that point, that's not even pride, that's self-destructive insanity. Yet, from Asmodeus' little tale, it kinda seems like the Shadim spooked Satan more than the primordial force of cosmic destruction that he was created to destroy. If that's the case, then yeah, I definitely believe such creatures would be strong enough to tank the Colt. As such, my official choices for my personal favorite version of the 5 things the Colt can't kill list is Archangels, Leviathans, Eve and anything exactly like her, Shadim, and the bearer of the mark of Cain. I truly believe that these were the beings to whom Lucifer was referring way back in Abandon All Hope, and that his statement implicitly excluded god-level beings, despite them also being cult-proof. If you don't agree with this list, then, well, I've already given you 3 more, so hopefully we can agree on one of those. If not, then leave a comment below listing your thoughts on who and or what can withstand the Colt. While you're there, why don't you like and subscribe and wire me $100? I'll have more content for you soon, but for now, carry on